In the dim, bustling corridors of the hospital, Thomas moved quickly, weaving between patients and doctors as he headed for his evening rounds. He was a dedicated nurse, compassionate and meticulous in his work, known among his colleagues for his gentle touch and deep empathy. But tonight, his thoughts lingered on memories of his grandmother, a woman who had raised him with warmth and strength, filling his childhood with stories and small treasures. Among those treasures was an old locket, delicate and silver, that she'd worn daily until her passing. Thomas had held on to that locket as a symbol of her love and wisdom, something tangible he could touch on days when he missed her most. As he rounded the corner toward room 209, something caught his eye. A glint of silver around the neck of an elderly woman waiting quietly by the window. His steps slowed, and his heart skipped a beat. The pendant she wore was unmistakable, a near replica of his grandmother's locket. Its intricate design, the tiny floral engravings, were just as he remembered. For a brief, surreal moment, Thomas felt as if he were seeing a piece of his grandmother's spirit in the woman before him. He composed himself and entered the room, clearing his throat. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Thomas, and I'll be your nurse tonight. Is there anything you need?" The woman looked up at him, her eyes sharp yet softened by age. She wore a gentle smile, though a hint of sadness lingered in her expression. "Good evening, Thomas," she replied, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I don't need much. Just someone to listen, perhaps." He nodded, feeling a tug at his heart. It wasn't unusual for patients to want companionship, especially those in long-term care, but there was something different about her, a quiet, poignant mystery that he couldn't ignore. "Is that your locket?" he asked, gesturing carefully, trying not to intrude. "It reminds me so much of one my grandmother used to wear." She brought a hand to the pendant, her fingers brushing its worn edges as if stirring memories she had long buried. "This old thing?" Her smile faded, and her eyes grew distant. "Yes, it's mine. A precious gift from someone I loved, but haven't seen in many years." A wave of emotion washed over Thomas, as if her words had tapped into a shared well of loss and remembrance. "It's a beautiful piece. My grandmother wore one almost exactly like it. I used to think it held all the stories she never told." The woman let out a soft, bittersweet laugh. "Perhaps in a way it does. Every line and curve carries something. A moment, a memory, a secret." There was silence between them, a comforting pause that felt as though it stretched across time. Thomas had always been drawn to his patients' stories, but this felt different, as though fate had placed him here, at this exact moment, to hear what this woman had to say. "Your grandmother must have been a wonderful woman," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying the weight of a long, hidden sorrow. "To have kept such treasures and shared them with you, I can see she left her mark on you." Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat, nodding. "She raised me. She was the strongest person I knew, though she rarely spoke of her own past. She always seemed to carry something, like an unspoken ache. I often wondered if there was something she wanted to share, but felt she couldn't." The woman lowered her gaze, her expression unreadable as she ran her thumb over the locket's surface. "Sometimes, people carry secrets not out of shame or regret, but out of love. They leave certain things unsaid because they believe it's best, even if it weighs on them." The air in the room grew heavier with her words, filling with a silent understanding. Thomas sensed that she, too, carried her own burdens, ones that perhaps, like his grandmother, had been tucked away in the folds of her heart for a lifetime. He wanted to ask, to know more, but felt it wasn't his place. As he gathered his things to leave, the woman reached out, her hand trembling slightly as it rested on his arm. "Thank you, Thomas," she murmured, her eyes misty. "Thank you for listening. I haven't spoken about this locket in, oh, so many years." He placed his hand gently over hers, offering a soft smile. "I'm here whenever you'd like to talk. Sometimes sharing a memory is the best way to honor it." She nodded, her smile tinged with sadness and gratitude. And as Thomas stepped out of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths had crossed for a reason, that somehow, this encounter held a significance he had yet to understand. In the back of his mind, a question lingered. Could this locket, so similar to his grandmother's, hold a connection he had never anticipated? The following evening, Thomas entered the hospital with a sense of purpose he couldn't quite explain. The memory of his encounter with the elderly woman and her mysterious locket had lingered in his mind throughout the day. There was a sense of incompleteness, a need to understand the unspoken connection he felt toward her. He tried to dismiss it as a passing curiosity, yet something kept pulling him back, as if her story, whatever it might be, held a meaning he was meant to uncover. Walking into her room, Thomas found her gazing out the window, her figure framed by the dim glow of the city lights beyond. She looked almost fragile, lost in thoughts he could only guess at, yet something about her posture spoke of quiet resilience. She had lived a life with its own trials, that much he sensed, and he wondered if anyone had ever truly listened to her heart. As he approached, she turned to him and offered a gentle smile, her eyes softening with recognition. "Good evening, Thomas," she greeted him, her voice as soft as the night outside. "You came back." He nodded, settling into a chair beside her. "I thought, maybe I could keep you company if you'd like. I couldn't help but think about our conversation yesterday." Her smile faded slightly, replaced by an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "There are things I haven't spoken of in years," she said, looking down at her hands. Her fingers absent-mindedly traced the edges of the locket, as if it were both a comfort and a burden. "Some memories fade, and others, they stay with you, whether you want them to or not." Thomas leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the pendant. "You mentioned that it was a gift from someone you loved. I couldn't help but wonder, was it someone very special to you?" She looked at him then, her gaze sharp yet distant, as if seeing both him and something else altogether. "Yes," she whispered, "more special than anyone. My sister and I, we were inseparable once, two halves of the same heart. People used to say we were as alike as two drops of water, identical in every way." A shiver ran down Thomas's spine as he listened, feeling the weight of her words settle within him. He had always known his grandmother to be a private person, a woman who had loved deeply but had often held back, keeping her thoughts to herself. Could this woman be talking about her? "She was everything to me," the woman continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes fate takes you down a path you never imagined, and you're left with choices that haunt you." Thomas swallowed, sensing that he was on the edge of learning something that would change his understanding of his own past. "What happened between you?" he asked gently, unsure if he had the right to pry, yet unable to stop himself. The woman looked out the window, her eyes misting over. "I loved someone I wasn't meant to, my sister's fiancé. He was charming, kind, and everything I dreamed of, but he loved her, not me. I knew it was wrong, and I tried to ignore it, tried to bury those feelings. But each time I saw them together, the pain grew sharper, until I couldn't bear it anymore." Thomas's heart ached as he listened, imagining the quiet torment she must have felt, watching the one she loved be happy with her sister. "And so, you left?" he ventured, already guessing the answer. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "I left with nothing but a letter, telling my sister that I loved her too much to stay and bring her pain. I couldn't watch them build a life together, knowing that my heart would always hold that secret. So I left and never looked back, thinking it would be easier that way." A heavy silence fell between them. Thomas struggled to find words, feeling both the sorrow of her story and a deep sympathy for the woman before him. He couldn't imagine the strength it must have taken to walk away, to choose loyalty over love, knowing she would never see her sister again. "What happened to him, to them?" he asked, his voice hushed. A tear slid down her cheek as she spoke. They married just as they were meant to. They built a family, one that I could only watch from a distance. I never reached out, not once. I thought I could move on, that maybe I'd find peace in time. But peace is hard to come by when your heart is divided, when the memories won't let you go. Thomas felt the impact of her words in his chest, the realization settling over him like a wave. His grandmother's quiet sadness, her distant gaze on family gatherings. Could it have been because she, too, felt the loss of her sister? He had always assumed that whatever had troubled her was something she had made peace with. But now he wondered if it had been a hidden wound she'd carried to her grave. The woman turned to him then, her eyes searching his face. "Do you have family, Thomas? People you hold dear?" He nodded, a pang of sadness in his own heart as he thought of the family members he had lost over the years. "Yes, I do. And I loved my grandmother very much. She was the world to me." A faint smile touched her lips. "Then you understand, don't you? How one choice, one moment, can shape a life or ruin it. I wanted to protect her from the truth, even if it meant losing her forever. I thought maybe I could live with that, but it left me hollow, like a shadow." Her words echoed in his mind as he absorbed the weight of her sacrifice, realizing just how profound her decision had been. The choice to leave, to live a life defined by absence and loss, had been made out of love, a love so deep it had cost her everything. The room felt heavier, the air thick with unspoken grief and the remnants of a past that could never be changed. Thomas wanted to say something, to comfort her, but he knew that words would fall short. All he could offer was his presence, the silent understanding that connected them in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Finally, she reached out, her hand trembling as it rested on his arm. "Thank you for listening, Thomas. I haven't told anyone this in decades. Maybe it's time I stopped running from my past." He placed his hand over hers, offering a warm, reassuring squeeze. Sometimes, sharing a memory can be the first step toward finding peace. "You're not alone anymore." As he left her room that night, Thomas felt as though he had stepped into a story that was still unfolding, a chapter of his family's history that had remained hidden until now. And as he walked down the corridor, he couldn't shake the feeling that this revelation, as painful as it was, had been waiting for him, guiding him toward a truth he had yet to fully understand. In the days that followed, Thomas found himself drawn to Emily's room each evening, feeling as though the invisible threads of his family's past were guiding him. Each conversation uncovered a new layer of Emily's heartache, and he listened with a quiet reverence, sensing that he was somehow piecing together fragments of a story that had long been forgotten. Emily's face softened whenever she spoke of his grandmother, her eyes holding memories she alone carried. Thomas could see the mixture of love, regret, and resilience that had shaped her life, and he felt a strange, poignant connection, as though he were bridging a chasm between the past and present. One evening, as Thomas was helping Emily adjust her blankets, she reached out and placed her hand gently over his, looking up with a vulnerability that touched him deeply. "Thomas," she murmured, "there's something you need to know, something I've carried for too long, and perhaps it's time to let it go." He paused, feeling a surge of anticipation. Her words held the weight of a confession, and he prepared himself to listen, knowing that whatever she was about to share could change the way he saw his family forever. "When I left," Emily began, her voice quivering slightly, "I left more than just my sister. I left everything that connected me to the life I knew. But I never stopped caring, never stopped watching from afar. I saw them together once, your grandparents. They were happy. It hurt, but it also gave me peace." Thomas's heart tightened as he imagined the scene. Emily watching his grandparents, observing their life from a distance, all the while carrying the heartache of knowing she could never be part of it. He could feel the years of longing, the quiet sacrifices she had made, unfolding before him in her trembling voice. "They had a son. Your father," she continued, her eyes fixed on a distant memory. I knew he was born. I knew they were building a family. That knowledge was enough, I thought, to bring me peace. But there were days. Oh, there were days when the loneliness was unbearable. The room grew silent, filled with the weight of her words. Thomas found himself at a loss, grappling with the realization that Emily had been watching his family grow from the shadows, always present but never seen, a ghost of love and sacrifice. The thought pained him, filling him with a sorrow he couldn't fully understand. I wanted to reach out so many times, Emily admitted, her voice cracking. But how could I? What could I have possibly said? I'm sorry for falling in love with the man you married, the man who became the father of your child. It would have shattered her. So I kept my distance, choosing silence over a truth that would have only brought pain. Thomas's eyes stung as he listened, his throat tight with the surge of emotions her confession had stirred. He couldn't imagine the strength it must have taken to keep such a secret, to walk away from a life she had once cherished, all for the sake of a love she couldn't allow herself to pursue. Emily, he whispered, struggling to find the right words, you didn't deserve to carry that alone. I can't imagine what that must have cost you. She looked up, her eyes brimming with unshed tears, a faint smile on her lips. Perhaps, but in a way I was always with them. I saw their joy, their sorrows. I was there in spirit even if they never knew. And that, strange as it may seem, became enough. A tear slipped down Thomas's cheek, and he made no move to wipe it away. The story she had shared filled him with a sense of gratitude and admiration, mixed with a lingering sadness for the years of happiness she had sacrificed. Emily's life had been one of quiet endurance, a testament to the depth of her love and loyalty. He wondered if his grandmother had ever sensed her sister's presence, a silent guardian watching over her from afar. Thomas wanted to honor her sacrifice, to let her know that her decision, however painful, had shaped his family in ways he hadn't understood until now. You gave my grandmother a gift she may never have known, he said, his voice gentle. Your choice allowed her to live her life, to find happiness without the burden of knowing. That's an incredible act of love. Emily's gaze softened, and she reached out, placing her hand on his cheek, a gesture filled with warmth and affection. Thank you, Thomas, she whispered. Thank you for listening, for understanding. I think, for the first time, I can feel a sense of peace. He held her hand in his, a silent promise passing between them. He felt as though he were finally seeing the full picture, each piece of her story illuminating his understanding of his own family's past. He knew now that he would carry this story with him, that Emily's sacrifice was part of the legacy he would honor. As they sat in silence, a calmness settled over the room. It was as though the years of pain and regret had lifted, replaced by a quiet contentment. Emily closed her eyes, her expression serene, and Thomas realized that this was the closure she had long sought. In that moment, he made a silent vow to himself. He would remember her story, honor her memory, and carry the love and sacrifice she had shown in his heart. He would share her story with those he loved, so that her life, though lived in shadows, would be remembered as a beacon of selfless devotion. When he left her room that night, Thomas felt as though he were walking away with a piece of his own heart transformed. Emily had given him a gift, a window into his family's past, one filled with pain, but also with immeasurable love. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a desire to live in a way that honored the sacrifice she had made. As he closed the door, he glanced back one last time, seeing her figure resting peacefully, a faint smile on her lips. He knew that in her heart, she had found the peace she had been searching for, and he hoped that, in some way, she knew that her story would live on, a testament to the love that bound their family across generations. In the days that followed, Thomas noticed a change in Emily. Her once heavy gaze seemed lighter, as if the burden she had carried for decades had finally begun to ease. Each evening, he would sit by her side, sometimes in silence, other times sharing pieces of his own life, little anecdotes about his childhood with his grandmother. Stories he now understood carried a connection to Emily. They were creating a bond built on shared memories and a newfound understanding, a quiet healing unfolding between them. One evening, as Thomas entered her room, he was surprised to find Emily looking through an old, worn photograph she must have retrieved from her belongings. She glanced up, her eyes twinkling with a glimmer of youth, as though she had stepped back into her past. She held the photo out to him with a soft smile. "Here," she said, her voice filled with a strange tenderness. "This is a piece of the life I left behind." Thomas took the photograph gently, studying the black and white image of two young women standing side by side, arms around each other. Both were smiling, their faces identical, their expressions full of hope and innocence. It was clear that one of those young women was his grandmother, and the other was Emily. He felt a jolt of emotion, as if he were looking at a window into a world he had never known, a piece of his family's story that had always been hidden from him. "You and Grandma," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You look so happy here." Emily's smile grew wistful. "We were happy. We were young, innocent, and believed that life would always stay that way. We had dreams, plans, and no idea of the choices life would soon force upon us." Thomas could hear the sorrow laced in her words, the remembrance of a simpler time before life had taken them down such divergent paths. He couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been if she had stayed, if the circumstances had allowed her to remain a part of their family. The image before him felt both precious and heartbreaking, a memory of what was and what could never be. Emily looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as though seeing a reflection of the sister she had lost. "Your grandmother, she was always the strong one. She was the one everyone admired, the one who could make others laugh, who had a way of making the world brighter just by being in it. And I loved her for that, even though it meant..." Her voice trailed off, the pain of old wounds resurfacing. Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, understanding that even though decades had passed, the ache of that love remained as vivid as ever. "She may have been strong," he said gently, "but I think you were stronger, Emily. To make the choice you did, I can't even imagine the courage that took." Emily's eyes welled up with tears, her hand trembling slightly as she reached out and touched his cheek, a gesture so filled with love it made Thomas's chest tighten. "Thank you, Thomas, for seeing that in me. Sometimes all a person needs is for someone to understand, to acknowledge the sacrifices that are often invisible." He held her hand, their shared silence speaking more than words could convey. For the first time, he felt he was not only a caretaker but a part of something larger, a bridge connecting Emily to the family she had lost, and in doing so, giving her a sense of belonging that had been absent for so long. Emily's gaze drifted back to the photograph, her expression softened by the flood of memories. "Your grandfather," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He was a kind man, too. He loved your grandmother with everything he had. And as painful as it was to see them together, I knew deep down that they were meant for each other. There was a purity in their love, something I couldn't tarnish." Thomas listened, his heart aching with a mix of sorrow and admiration. His grandfather had passed before he could remember much about him, but knowing now that his grandparents' love had come at such a price made their story resonate even more deeply. He felt as though he were understanding his own roots in a way he never had before, gaining insight into the quiet struggles and triumphs that had shaped his family. Emily looked at him, her expression soft but resolute. "Thomas, you have a kindness in you just like they did. Something you've carried forward, a legacy of love that I see in the way you care for people. I may not have been part of your family, but seeing you, it's almost like having a glimpse of the life I could have had." Her words struck him profoundly, leaving him humbled and deeply moved. He hadn't considered himself part of any grand legacy, but hearing Emily's perspective made him realize that love and compassion were indeed qualities that had been passed down. values he now carried on behalf of both women who had shaped his life, even in silence. Emily leaned back, her gaze drifting to the ceiling as if she were staring into the distant stars, recalling her own dreams from long ago. Perhaps it's selfish of me, but having you here, listening, sharing, it's almost like having a piece of the family I lost. It's a comfort I never expected. Thomas felt the weight of her words and reached for her hand once more, their fingers intertwining in a gesture of unity. He wanted to assure her that her sacrifices had not been in vain, that her story, though hidden, had found its way to someone who would cherish it. "I'll remember everything you've told me, Emily," he promised, his voice filled with conviction. "I'll carry your story forward. You'll always have a place in our family's memory, even if it's just through me." A look of peace crossed her face, and she nodded, as though his words had given her the closure she'd been seeking. "Thank you, Thomas. Knowing that my story will be remembered means more than I can say." As he rose to leave, Emily's hand remained in his, reluctant to let go. She held his gaze, her eyes filled with both gratitude and a sense of finality, as though this moment marked the end of her journey, the closure she had longed for. That night, Thomas left her room with a heart heavier yet fuller than it had ever been. He felt the profound impact of their connection, a bond forged not only by blood but by shared pain, love, and resilience. And as he walked down the dimly lit hallway, he knew that Emily's story would forever be etched in his heart, a reminder of the love that transcended time, choice, and even loss. In the following days, Thomas sensed a calmness in Emily that he hadn't seen before. She seemed lighter, as if the weight she had carried for so long had finally been lifted. Her eyes, once shadowed by years of sorrow, now held a soft glow, a quiet peace that spoke of acceptance. But as much as she seemed at ease, there was also a growing fragility about her. She was weaker, her breath shorter, her movements slower, as if she were reaching the end of a long journey. One evening, as Thomas was finishing his rounds, he found himself hesitating outside her door. He felt an unspoken urgency, a need to see her, to ensure she was well. When he finally entered, he saw her lying in bed, looking more frail than ever, her skin pale against the white sheets. She opened her eyes as he approached, offering him a gentle smile, though it took effort. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I was hoping you'd come." He took a seat beside her, his hand instinctively reaching for hers. "Of course, Emily. I'm here," he said, squeezing her hand gently, trying to infuse his words with the strength she seemed to lack. She looked at him, her gaze filled with a tenderness that touched him deeply. "You've been so kind to me, more than I ever expected. I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to thank me," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You've given me so much more than I could ever give you. Knowing your story, it's a gift, one I'll carry with me forever." Emily nodded, her smile fading as she seemed to gather the last of her strength. "There's one last thing I want to tell you," she murmured, her voice trembling with the weight of her words. "Something I've kept hidden all these years. I think it's time." Thomas leaned forward, sensing the gravity of her confession. He braced himself, knowing that whatever she was about to share would be the final piece of her story, the last truth she had kept close to her heart. "When I left, I told myself I was doing it for her, for your grandmother," Emily began, her gaze distant. "But part of me also left because I was afraid of living in her shadow, of always being the one who loved in silence, who stayed in the background. I thought that by leaving, I could finally be free from that feeling, that I could find my own life, my own purpose." She paused, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "But the truth is, I never found that freedom. Instead, I spent my life haunted by what I left behind. I ran from it, thinking I was escaping, but I carried it with me wherever I went." Thomas felt a deep ache in his chest as he listened, realizing the depth of her isolation, the silent prison she had built for herself. She had left to find freedom, yet she had spent her life bound to a past she could never truly escape. "Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with compassion, "you did what you thought was best. You acted out of love, even if it came at a cost. That's not something to regret." A tear slipped down her cheek, and she shook her head slightly. "It's hard not to regret, Thomas. I loved my sister deeply, but I also loved him. And there's a part of me that always wondered, what if I had stayed, if I had told them the truth? Could things have been different?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with unfulfilled dreams and unanswered questions. Thomas could feel the pain of her unresolved past, the lingering what-ifs that had haunted her for so long. He knew that no words could erase those doubts, but he hoped that by listening, by simply being there, he could offer her a sense of closure. Emily took a shaky breath, her hand gripping his with surprising strength. "But perhaps it's enough to know that my story will be remembered, that I won't be just a shadow. Through you, Thomas, I can be seen." Her words filled him with a profound sense of responsibility, a duty to carry her story forward. He squeezed her hand, his voice firm with promise. "You won't be forgotten, Emily. I'll make sure your story lives on. You're part of our family, part of me, and I'll honor that." A faint smile graced her lips, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fading. "That means more to me than you'll ever know." They sat together in silence, the connection between them deeper than words. Thomas felt as though he were witnessing the closing of a chapter, the end of a story that had been waiting for this moment to find its resolution. He stayed with her, holding her hand, offering her comfort in the only way he knew how. As the hours passed, Emily drifted into sleep, her breathing soft and steady. Thomas watched over her, feeling a mix of sadness and peace, knowing that her journey was nearing its end. He had seen patients pass before, had witnessed the final moments of those who had lived long lives. But this was different. This was personal. In the quiet of the room, he closed his eyes, letting himself remember everything she had told him, each memory she had shared, each moment of love and sacrifice. He felt her presence, not just as his patient, but as family, as someone who had given him a piece of himself he hadn't known was missing. When the first light of dawn crept through the window, Emily's breathing slowed, each breath softer than the last. Thomas felt the shift, the gentle passing, as if her spirit had finally found peace. He held her hand until it grew still, his heart heavy with loss but filled with gratitude. He whispered a quiet farewell, his voice trembling. "Thank you, Emily, for everything. Promise, I'll keep your story alive." With a final, tender touch, he let go, his fingers lingering on her hand for a moment longer. The room felt empty without her, yet he could sense her presence all around him, in the memories she had left, in the love she had shared. As he walked out of her room, he carried with him a piece of her heart, a piece of his own family's history, and a story that would live on in his memory. Emily's life had been one of sacrifice and resilience, and he knew that her legacy would not end here. For more heartwarming stories like this, click on the card to watch similar tales that will touch your heart. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. I love reading your comments.